Well, we're picking up our series again on building the bridge over the River Wye. We've already covered building the scenery, and now we're getting on to actual construction of the actual bridge. It's a wood truss bridge. I love these wood truss bridges. We've seen them all over the place on the narrow gauge. I think this is going to be one of the coolest parts of the outdoor railroad.
Oh, it certainly is. It looks like a piece of furniture to me. The quality of the wood is beautiful.
And it's part of the railroad that we've been calling the Never Mine. There's a mine down here. And this has actually been a major part of the project now for a couple of years.
All right.
Now, if you've been following along with our railroad, half of the railroad winds around the backyard here on benchwork, and the other half of the railroad is actually inside. So the outside part is sort of like the inside part in that it's all on wood benchwork, except that it's outside.
Right.
We build it this way simply because it's a lot easier to maintain.
Well, also to run trains and such. Who wants to get down on the ground when you're our age?
My first railroad was all down on the ground, and, well, I was much younger then.
Right, but boy, I'll tell you, creaky knees and that, it just seems good to have it at eye length and arm length.
And the north end of the outdoor part here is the mine, the Never Mine, and it's also where the trains come out from inside, and they come down a 4% grade here and cross over this area that we're calling the River Wye. It's really just a gully or something, but I envisioned clear back when designing the railroad that this would just be really a great place to have a bridge, and one of the few places outdoors where we can have a bridge.
Right.
And so now for about 3 years, all that's been down here are these two pieces of 2x4 holding up the track.
Well, at least you can run the train that way, but it doesn't look very good.
It's a little, yeah. So now let's get on to actually building the bridge.
So I see you've hired a crew of action figures?
Well, I wish I could have, frankly. There's some really tight places to work in here, and it really would have been handy to have some 1/20th scale people to just put on the project.
Wasn't that what that is?
So what I actually did is I started by researching how these truss bridges actually work, because while I've messed around with truss bridges, I don't have a very deep understanding of them. So I started by just trying to figure out how exactly a truss bridge works. And as it turns out, there's so many different designs and different styles. There's Warren bridges and Howe bridges, and they're kind of the same thing, but just subtly different. And then on top of that, I found that I wanted to change up my design. I had built a truss bridge years and years ago that was built more or less to prototype standards, where the diagonal elements are on the loose. They're just floating in there against blocks, and then the whole thing is held together with truss rods. And what I found is I was always doing maintenance on that. I'd have to tighten up the truss rods, and the diagonal pieces had come loose. And so I wanted to come up with a design where the diagonal elements are actually bolted in place so they can't just come loose. It's fine to build a actual prototype design when you're working indoors, but man, everything changes when you're working out in the garden, because the sun heats things up and the winter cools things off, and everything changes shape and dimension. And unless you want a pile of toothpicks underneath where your bridge used to sit, you really need to design around the changing and violent elements. You would think that simply following prototype practice where the original bridges were out in the elements, all you'd be doing is scaling everything down and it would just work. But what you can't scale down is physics. And when you're working outdoors on a garden railroad, the difference between the way things are done on a prototype and the way things are going to need to be done on a model railroad are considerable. So I resurrected an old technology that dates back to when these bridges would have been built in the first place and invoked something called a pencil and a piece of paper.
So in other words, you got the lead out.
Number 2, as a matter of fact.
Exactly.
I also needed to make sure that the bridge would actually fit the gap in the railroad here. So I was taking careful measurements, and then as I would put together the most rudimentary forms, I'd take them outside and set them in place, knowing full well that there were going to be issues that I couldn't quite predict with my pencil and paper, but were going to be issues nevertheless. So the easiest way to figure those things out is just test everything. And so, yes, here's the first issue that I found right here. I had sort of predicted the width of the bridge when I did the scenery over here, and as it happens, I've gotten the cement cliffs way too close to the area where the bridge needs to go, and the bridge is going to collide with the cliffs. So a few sticks of dynamite here to blast away some rock, following prototype practice, and that should fix the problem. NMRA standards for F-scale say to have a full 8 inches of clearance here, but what I have found in a few places on the railroad where things are just plain narrow, I can get away with 7 inches as long as there's absolutely no curvature in the track, that everything is perfectly straight, and I have been able to get away with 7 inches, but I would prefer 8. Okay, back to the truss design. Normally the diagonal elements would be much more square. I'm using a flat piece of wood because what I need to do is sandwich the diagonal elements into the top and bottom beams so that I can run a bolt through there and secure everything in place so that it can't possibly come loose. And just as on the prototype, half of the diagonal elements are doubled up. Some are single, some are double, and then again everything goes all the way through to the top and bottom of the top beam and bottom beam so that I can run a bolt straight down through the entire junction there, the entire joint, and bolt everything in place. I've been buying all of my bolts from AlbanyCountyFasteners.com because it's the only place I have found that offers a trim hex head cap screw in the small sizes. They're still somewhat oversized compared to scale, but not by very much. They look really nice and they function really well. Their standard order is for either 1,000 pieces or 10,000 pieces, which is a few more than I actually need. So, but if you just set the quantity to a lower value, suddenly it will apply a discount of around, $530, which is nice. On the prototype, the top and bottom beams are made out of a lamination of flat boards, if you will, which helps prevent warping. So you can see here how I'm handling that. I'm running my diagonal pieces all the way down through the top and bottom beams and then cutting everything on an angle and still creating the sandwiched layers that you would normally find in the top and bottom beam, only in this case my diagonal elements are extending all the way through to the top and bottom of those beams. There are also these vertical elements. Some of these truss bridges have a vertical post here, some of them do not. And after messing around with it for quite a bit of time, I decided that I would put these vertical posts in at every other joint because I want to do truss rods, and these kind of cover up the truss rods, and frankly it looks better having the truss rods exposed. So I thought, well, I need the vertical element to help hold everything in square, but I don't need it at every single joint, so I'm only going to put them in at every other joint. Now we've got about, I don't know, 300 pounds of this zinc casting metal. We tried casting with zinc, and frankly, it's way more trouble than it's worth. But boy, these ingots are kind of handy to have around just to use as paperweights, if you will. In this case, just weights to hold all of the trusses together while the glue dries. I'm planning to glue everything together, but the glue joints aren't going to be counted on to hold everything together long term. Once the trusses are built, then again, everything will be bolted through. But just to simplify the construction, I'm gluing everything together, even though the glue joints may be permanent, may be temporary. It won't really matter because everything's going to be bolted as well as glued. Here I'm just checking the alignment on the various pieces, and then when I'm absolutely certain that everything's going to work, I apply glue between all of the different layers and then clamp it together. And once it's dry, it's a pretty rigid truss all by itself. If I were working indoors, this would be just fine. But again, where I'm working outdoors, I want everything to be both glued and mechanically fastened. I used every single clamp that we have in the entire shop, which is quite a few clamps, and still I could have had more. But it all came together quite nicely. A few of these pieces, like the very end pieces here, could actually be added after the fact, if you will, because they're just a loose piece that goes over the end of the diagonal piece. As I'm building these directly over the top of full-size plans, the two different trusses should come out identical, but I wanted to test them to make sure that all of the cross pieces align with each other, mostly just for appearance. If they were off a little bit, it wouldn't hurt anything, but it might look screwy. And then, of course, I want to take everything outside and double check that everything fits and aligns properly. In truth, I know they will because I've already test fit them, but it's still fun to bring them out here just to see how it's going to look.
Well, that's the fun part, is to test fit it. Just don't get in a hurry and fit it in there too quickly.
Yeah, and it is, after all, screwing around more than it is anything else, and seeing it come together, that's the fun.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in checking clearances, as you can see, I don't have the full 7 inches. In fact, I'd like to have a little bit more than 7 inches here in clearance. I checked it by placing a freight car in place, and there's plenty of room for the freight car to clear. But I do want to make sure that I have an absolute minimum 7 inches between the two trusses. I'd prefer even 8 inches to follow NMRA standards, but I know that everything will clear 7 inches because I've got that in place on a couple of spots on the railroad, and it works just fine. But as you can see, it certainly wouldn't clear a man on the side of the car, if you will. It's pretty tight clearance. The largest thing that we have, the widest thing, is your caboose.
I'm aware of how wide my caboose is.
No, the caboose that Al made for you.
Oh, that one?
The narrow gauge, the Rio Grande Southern caboose that Al made.
Oh, absolutely. What would you think I was thinking?
Well, when Al built it, I don't know, he just overstated the width just slightly of your caboose, and so it actually ends up being the widest thing on the whole railroad.
Yeah, I guess he was trying to build me a she shed on wheels.
You always said you wanted one.
Absolutely.
It looked like a caboose.
Yes, there it is. Complete with amenities.
It's the caboose.
Yes. Large and in charge.
Now, the reason I want to have these vertical elements on the trusses is this, I think, is the best way to ensure that the trusses are square to the horizontal elements running across the bottom of the bridge. And since there is no top element, it's an open truss at the top, the best way to ensure that these trusses are square and remain square is to use these vertical elements. I spent a good deal of time trying to figure out what the best way would be to attach the horizontal elements that run under the trusses to these vertical elements because again, I don't want to just trust a glue joint. And what I came up with is to attach these blocks on the inside of the truss, and then that way I'll be able to bolt through both the vertical element and the horizontal element by placing a bolt both vertically and horizontally through these blocks. I'm also extending the braces that run under the trusses to a position beyond the vertical element so that I can add a diagonal element there for strength. Unfortunately, there's just no room to do that on the cliff side, so I'm only doing that on the other side. It'll look really neat and it will add some strength. And now to blast away some of the existing concrete scenery here. I was very pleasantly surprised to find that it was really hard to do. If this had just broken away easily, it's like it's just a matter of time before the weather knocks this whole thing down. But no, it's really quite strong, and it took a good deal of chiseling to break any of this away. But I kept setting the bridge in place to find out just how much cement I needed to remove in order to get the truss to fit in without having any curvature in the track, so the track could go straight down through there and the bridge would not interfere with the cliff, or rather the cliff would not interfere with the bridge, I guess.
Well, that's the idea behind model railroading, isn't it? Just try to see how much stuff you can fit into a teeny space.
Yeah, and there's that expression people use, selective compression.
I like it.
Yeah, so you can't model the real world, so you just kind of pick out the stuff that you really want to do.
Okay, so the next time you go into my secret room, you'll know why it's so crowded.
Okay, everything's glued together, and I filled in the spaces at the top with a little Bondo filler just for appearance. The horizontal elements there are just setting in place to hold the thing upright. They're not glued. And now I'm ready to start drilling 100 holes and placing 100 bolts through here to bolt the whole thing together. I'm using, I think, 4 different sizes of bolts on here. I figured out ahead of time exactly what I needed and had to order some more from Albany County Fasteners. We have a whole bunch of different nuts and bolts on hand here for doing this kind of work, but as it always works out, we were missing a couple of the sizes I need. Most of the holes were drilled on the drill press to ensure that they're absolutely square to the wood beams. Don't want the screws running through here at an angle, but a few of the holes had to be hand drilled just with a drill, and at that point it's critical that you're very careful to make sure that you're absolutely square to the beam. Most of the bolts are a nut bolt and washer, but these bolts at the very center of the cross pieces here have no washer, and in fact they're countersunk on both the nut and the bolt side. I wanted to ensure that there was no way that something could be extending to the inside where it might snag a piece of passing equipment. And the only bolts that I had that would really fit through here were just a little bit too short, and I didn't really want to put a longer bolt in here and cut it off, so I opted to just countersink these. The most complicated bit of bolting occurs where the vertical posts are. That requires 3 bolts at both the top and the bottom, but the 3 at the bottom, 2 are horizontal and 1 is vertical, where the 3 at the top are all 3 horizontal, but the center one is slightly lower than the other 2. The horizontal bolts at the bottom are also way too long, but they're really easy to get to trim back flush to the nut. I needed to check squareness and alignment as I added the second truss, and what that required is actually putting it together and taking it apart a couple of different times so that I could check it for squareness and then drill more holes and add more bolts. Same system here for cross bolting the horizontal elements that tie the 2 trusses together. The difference being that on this side, the horizontal element doesn't extend past the vertical element because we're right up against the cliff face on this side. And then once everything is in place, coming back and cutting off the excess screw, the excess bolt here. And then, of course, taking the whole thing back outside to triple check that everything is fitting and that the track will go down through here nice and straight without any bend in it, and that I don't need to remove any more cliff. Well, we're going to have to cut this off right here and pick it up on the next show.
Oh yes, it's an ongoing thing.
We still have truss rods and staining and track lane. We have a lot yet to cover. And hopefully you're all going to want to follow along with that. And so the easiest way to be notified when the next show goes up is to become a subscriber and then set your little notification bell so you will be notified.
Right.
And the easy peasy way to become a subscriber is by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday.
Right.
We'll see ya.
We'll see ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.